Excellent. Okay, welcome everyone to tonight's Jersey Friendly Yards webinar. First, let me introduce you to our Jersey Friendly Yards team. Besides myself, Karen Walzer, I work for Barnegat Bay Partnership. We have our speaker for tonight, Dr. Steve Yergeau from Rutgers Cooperative Extension, and also Becky LeBoy from the Ocean County Soil Conservation District. We all work together on the Jersey Friendly Yards initiative. And tonight we're lucky to have as our speaker Dr. Steve Yergeau, and he's going to give us a lot of great tips about how to water wisely. First, let me just give you a little background about Dr. Steve. He's the Rutgers Cooperative Extension Agent and Associate Professor with Ocean and Atlantic Counties, where he conducts education programs and does research that addresses water resource protection and management. Dr. Steve received a PhD in environmental sciences from Rutgers University in 2010, and he has over 25 years of experience in coastal water quality management. Just before he starts, I just want to mention if you do have a question, please enter it into the chat feature or the Q&A. Make sure you address it to everyone so we can all see your questions, and Dr. Steve will answer them at the end of his program. Thank you.
All right, we all set to go, Karen?
We're all set. Take it away.
Okay, so you guys can hear me okay?
Yes.
All right, great. I'm actually going to turn off my camera just because it's a little distracting to watch myself as I'm doing the talk. But thank you, everybody, for joining us this evening. Today, we're going to be talking about getting back to the basics of doing a Jersey-friendly yard. And as we've been doing in this webinar series for 2022 is going through each of the 8 steps for how you can get closer to having a more sustainable, environmentally friendly, and of course, Jersey-friendly yard. So today we're at step 3, which is to water wisely. Becky LeBoy, the other partner who's on the call tonight, she did the first 2 steps talking about planting before you plant, and then also doing soil, maintaining soil health. So tonight I'm doing step 3, water wisely. And basically the question I want you to have in your mind is when it comes to water and your yard and your landscape, what are you doing to your yard, or what are you doing to your yard? So just keep that in your mind as to how you're using water in your landscape and at home. I'm going to be talking about some things you can do to use water wisely. I'm going to obviously be talking about things that are happening outside your house. I'm not going to be going inside the 4 walls of the house and talking about how you can conserve water in bathrooms, kitchens, that kind of stuff. We're going to be talking about what you can do around your yard and in your landscape. So anything that's outside the 4 walls of your home, your apartment building, etc. So as Karen said, my name is Steve Yergeau, and I'm a county agent with Ocean and Atlantic Counties with Rutgers Cooperative Extension. For those of you who do not know what Cooperative Extension is, I'd just like to give a brief introduction as to what Cooperative Extension is. We work with local communities and use science-based information and education to help people adapt to, a rapidly changing society and improve their quality of life. We do that through a couple of different departments and in Extension. We have our 4-H youth development. So if you've heard of 4-H, that's part of Cooperative Extension. If you've heard of the Rutgers Master Gardeners program or Master Gardeners, that's part of Cooperative Extension. So we work with people on agriculture and horticultural issues. We work with people on natural resources protection and environmental stewardship. That's really where I fit in, and Jersey Friendly Yards fits in and kind of blends in that home horticulture and Rutgers Master Gardener programming. We also do some work in Ocean, Monmouth, and Atlantic counties in marine fisheries and aquaculture, but we also do work in nutrition and wellness education. So we kind of hit every aspect of people's lives from when they're kids with 4-H to when they get older and looking at nutrition and wellness and having them have the free time to volunteer for programs, say like Master Gardeners, etc. But I did put the website for the New Jersey Agricultural Experiment Station, which houses Cooperative Extension. So if you want to find out more information about it, there it is, so you can do that. I'll make sure that I send out the slides so that they're available for people afterwards if they want to use the links, etc. But today, we're not talking all about Cooperative Extension. We are talking about conserving water and using water wisely. So I guess the first question to answer for folks, if they don't know the answer already, is why conserve water? Why is it important that we conserve water? Well, water primarily, as a source comes from precipitation. There's also water in our groundwater systems and our aquifers, but the main source of water that we get is from precipitation, rainfall, snow melt, etc. And that can kind of be spotty. So you can see here, because I work in Ocean County in southern New Jersey, a lot of the headlines I have here from a couple of years ago talk about Ocean County being under a drought watch, South Jersey being under issued drought watches because there's not enough water to supply them. In New Jersey, we only get about 42 to 45 inches of rain per year. I know last year seemed kind of outside the norm, and I'll get into that in a second, where we got a little bit excessive amount of water, but we do average about 42 to 45 inches of rainfall per year. So not only is it important that we conserve water for those times when we are below those averages, but since water is a resource that we utilize every single day to basically stay alive, and we use so many gallons per day, we got to make sure that there are plenty of supplies for our uses, whether it be, in manufacturing, at home in showers, to cook with, to drink, etc. We've got to make sure that there's plenty of water out there for us to actually function and survive on a daily basis. In New Jersey, the average amount of water use per day per person is about 70 gallons. That's 70 gallons. And the map you can see on the left part of this slide shows where some of those sources are coming from and how many people are utilizing them. So, for example, the bottom half of the different color ramps you see, where it's like turquoise and then pink and then purple and then red, that tells you where the water's coming from, whether it be groundwater, rivers and streams, the Delaware River, or reservoirs being the red one. But then you have the average annual use is the color of the county that pie chart is in. So the blue is 0 to 10,000. In the dark green is over 100,000 people, is the average amount of annual withdrawals in millions of gallons. So you can see some areas are kind of thirstier than others, I guess is the best way to describe it. So you can see some parts of northeastern New Jersey where you see a lot more population. In the northern part of the state, there's more water withdrawals because there's more people there. So on a daily basis, even though they're using millions of gallons of water per year, on average for each resident in New Jersey, it's about 70 gallons per day. That number more than doubles in the growing season in the summertime based upon landscaping use. So it goes from 70 gallons per day to about 155 gallons per day for each resident. So it jumps from about $630 million to, 630 million gallons of water per year based upon the 9 million people living in New Jersey to over like 1.2 billion gallons in the summertime, when you would expect these drought conditions to be, because it's warmer out, it's hotter, water is evaporating faster, more people are using water to stay cool, more people are using water in their landscape. So that's where that higher number comes from, that 155 gallons per day. So this irrigation that we're doing in our landscapes is really affecting how much water we're using. And so there are ways you can kind of conserve water, especially in that critical time period where rainfall, as I mentioned before, being the primary source of water for the state of New Jersey, in terms of how we get it to our groundwater systems, our rivers, and our lakes. By having that precipitation be kind of spotty and haphazard in the summertime, and having the highest uses be in the summertime, you can see there's a little bit of a disconnect. So if you're able to capture the water when it's available, that would be the best way to help conserve water. So capturing rainwater is one of the strategies you can take, and I'll go into that later on. But we got to flip the script, and we go from the situation where we're under drought conditions to where we have too much water. And a few years ago in 2018, we started to call that the wettest year on record in New Jersey for some of the portions, like southeastern New Jersey. Wettest year in New Jersey history was county by county breakdown. You can see that headline for 2018. And then last year happened, and you can see on the bottom right photo in the story, they referred to 2021 as being unprecedented. So you can see that in just a couple of years, we're like, oh, it's the wettest year on record with all the rainfall we had. And then just 3 years later, we're like, this is unprecedented. We had the storms Ida come through in September and fall of 2021, causing major flooding issues and problems. And the photo on the bottom right is the Somerset baseball team stadium that got flooded out due to the nearby streams just kind of overfilling its banks. So we need to conserve water when there's too much water, not because there's so much water, so why should we conserve water if we've got all this water coming through? It's really what's coming along with that water as it's flooding through these streets and these buildings, etc. So in addition to this water kind of moving through, there are a lot of pollutants that are associated with it that come in that runoff and that flashy floods that happen and that flooding that happens in various areas throughout New Jersey. So I refer to this as kind of like the alphabet soup of pollutants that we have out there. Some of them are probably familiar to you, some of them might not be so much. But things like sediment, being soil particles that get transported from one area to another. If you ever seen a stream or a river after a rainstorm and it gets kind of like that chocolatey brown color, that's probably a lot of the sediment that's kind of dislodged from the stream banks and is filling up the stream and being carried downstream to somewhere else. There's something else called BOD, or biochemical oxygen demand, which is basically just any sort of carbon material or any sort of organic material that gets into our waterways, like leaves and other materials, twigs, broken down, plant parts broken down, animal parts. And what happens is those carbon sources get utilized by organisms in the stream. And as they get broken down, they use up a lot of oxygen. So they get respirated, like when we respire, like taking in oxygen, they get respirated, and that can cause an oxygen deficit, hence it being called an oxygen demand. So there's a higher demand for oxygen that's taken out of the waterways because of this breakdown of those materials. And then we can have toxic materials like pesticides, so your herbicides, fungicides, insecticides, other poisons that get basically put out into the environment and put on lawns. Heavy metals, we're thinking about things that happen to our soil, are part of additives that get added to soil. Any sort of automotive emissions or anything that comes off of tires or any metal breakdown, so lead, zinc, mercury, petroleum hydrocarbons, things that come from like oils and greases and fuels, and any sort of automotive exhaust. Those things are toxic to organisms in the environment in small doses and can basically kill some of the fauna that's out there. And then there are things like nutrients, which are necessary for survival, like nitrogen and phosphorus. But if they're applied in larger doses than are needed, then they can become a problem. So anything kind of outside a moderate level can become a problem. But some of these other things, like the toxic materials, even in small doses, can be a problem. But things like nitrogen and phosphorus, when they're applied through fertilizers, even it can be found in some compost, some manures, etc. If they're applied in higher rates than are needed by the soil or the plants that are growing in that soil, then that can become a problem and it can kind of, cause plants to take over. So if you've ever heard of any sort of algal bloom in coastal areas like Barnegat Bay, where the water just becomes, filled with all that mucky plant material, that can be due to an excess amount of nutrients that are causing all those plants to just kind of do a population explosion and take over an area. So those nutrients can become a problem, and look for things like bacteria and pathogens, which are materials that can make you sick, primarily from fecal matter that comes from pets, waterfowl, failing septic systems, other wildlife that's out there. So that's why we always tell people to pick up after your pets, because you don't want that material to get in the waterway and make organisms or people sick. One of the other things that people don't think about is thermal stress. I'll be going into a little bit about impervious cover in a minute. But when you have concrete or asphalt or these kind of dark materials that water doesn't penetrate, it just sits on the surface. Well, that dark material heats up in the sun, and when that water lands on it, it gets heated up as well and can get its way to a local stream. And that small amount that's been heated up can actually affect the stream temperature and can cause some sensitive organisms, to not spawn properly, not lay eggs properly. Sometimes their young cannot develop properly after they hatch out of their eggs, etc. So it can really cause some problems in the long term for some of the organisms that are out there. You can also have thermal stress on streams by having a loss of any sort of vegetation cover. So the shading that's provided by larger trees, larger shrubs, larger bushes can have a cooling effect on the stream. But if you lose that, then you're going to heat up the stream as well, because you have more direct sunlight getting on the water itself. So both those kind of things are adding thermal stress. And then finally, talking about debris, we're talking about any sort of material that shouldn't be out in the environment that gets out in the environment. So any sort of litter, any sort of illegal dumping, and obviously plastics and microplastics are part of that as well. I know that there was a study that came out a couple of weeks ago where they said they started to see microplastics in some select humans in their blood systems. So it's pretty pervasive. So, we need to work to reduce the plastics as much as we can. But those are the kind of things that, don't break down in the environment and can cause problems, in terms of clogging the streams, getting in our bloodstreams, causing some problems, etc. But really what I'm talking about here is in terms of the amount of precipitation that's coming, whether we get too much or too little, or if we have all this polluted runoff coming through. What I'm really talking about here is the disruption to the water cycle. So the water cycle is the movement of water through the environment as it goes from the atmosphere, comes down as precipitation, lands on a surface. It can either become runoff, it can get infiltrated into the ground through the soil, it can be taken up by plants, it can go to a water body, whether it be a pond, a lake, a river, a stream, a creek, or eventually something like Barnegat Bay or the Atlantic Ocean. And then it evaporates from those water bodies and through the plants and it goes back up into the atmosphere, turns into precipitation, comes back down, and the whole cycle goes over and over again. So what I was talking about in terms of the plumes and stuff is really, the changes that happen in the landscape and create surface runoff. You can kind of see it in the middle left portion of this graphic here, the surface runoff. Precipitation lands on a surface. It can undergo a couple of different things. It can get absorbed into the soil and infiltrate into the soil and become part of the groundwater. It can get utilized by plants. Plant roots can start to take it up. Plants can, the leaves can intercept the water before it hits the ground. It can go into some sort of storage system like a lake or a pond, and then eventually evaporate directly back into the atmosphere from there. Or it can land into a stream and work its way down to somewhere like Barnegat Bay or the ocean. Or it can become runoff if it can't get absorbed in the ground. It becomes runoff and just flows over the land and runs over the land. So that's really what I'm talking about. So I just want to kind of go over briefly the water cycle and show you guys what we're talking about here, especially as we're talking about Jersey friendly yards and how do we manage our landscape to help reduce that runoff and actually get the water back into the ground and into the plants that really need it. Well, there's a couple things we need to keep in mind when we're talking about the water cycle. There's a couple of factors that affect the water cycle. Obviously, weather and climate. Like I said before, New Jersey, we get anywhere from 42 to 45 inches of rain per year. Just a fun fact, on the West Coast, up in the northern part of the United States, in Alaska, there are some parts of Alaska that get up to 300 inches of rain per year. So think about a 1-inch rainstorm basically every single day. That's how much water they get. So they have to deal with more runoff. They might have some soils that are really absorbent and can infiltrate the soil. Depends on what happens in terms of the amount of weather and the climate that you have. So if you have a wet, rainy area, or if you have somewhere like the southeastern part of the United States, Nevada, Arizona, those kind of areas where it's much drier and less humid, you have less water. So they have smaller amounts of rainfall that they're dealing with every year. So how do you manage runoff from those kind of areas that are kind of too much larger and much smaller than what we get in New Jersey? One of the other factors that affects the water cycle is land use and what we do to land and how we manage it. As you can imagine, having an open area like a park or a forested area is vastly different than, say, like a downtown cityscape where you have a lot of impervious cover, that concrete, that asphalt, glass, etc., that's not allowing water to get absorbed back into the ground. I'll go into that in a little bit of detail in the next slide. And obviously vegetation can affect the water cycle. If you have more vegetation, it can absorb more of the water. Generally, if you have healthy native local vegetation, then you'll have healthier soils and that can actually absorb a lot of the water as it precipitates and as it lands from a rainfall. Soil type will affect the water cycle. If you have soil that's very porous, that's very absorbent, can infiltrate something that's got a lot of sand in it, like we generally have in Ocean County, then it can actually cause the water to infiltrate rather quickly. Soils that have a lot of clay material within it, which are very small particles, think of Play-Doh, think of modeling clay, that doesn't allow a lot of water to go through. So if you have a lot of clay, it's not as absorbent, it can't infiltrate the water as much. And then also the presence of water bodies. So if you have ponds, lakes, reservoirs, big areas that are going to store water, that'll help, reduce the amount of runoff that you have, but it'll also slow down the runoff that you do generate because it'll fill up these big water bodies and be stored there for a little bit. And then it may flood a little bit, but it will be a lot less than what would come through if that water body hadn't been there to capture at least some of the runoff as it was coming through. So those are different factors that affect the water cycle. And I've mentioned impervious cover, and I've talked a little bit about development, but I really like this slide because it kind of shows us what happens to the water cycle as we kind of increase the amount of development in an area. So we go clockwise from the upper left, down to the bottom left. We have kind of an increasing amount of impervious cover, and actually the highest amount of impervious cover is on the bottom right when we're looking at complete build out of like a downtown area up to 100% impervious surfaces. So remember, impervious surfaces are those surfaces that cannot absorb water. So water is going to run off of those. So let's look at the two extremes. So we have a natural ground cover in the upper left, and the blue arrows represent the different portion of the precipitation as it falls on the landscape and what happens to it and what part of the water cycle it goes into. So 40% of that precipitation will evaporate back into the atmosphere, 10% will become runoff, and then 50%, 50, will get infiltrated back into the ground, either shallow infiltration or deep infiltration, also known as percolation. So about half of the water will get back into the groundwater system, maybe recharge some aquifers, help to make those plants grow through their root systems and maintain a healthy soil. So now let's look at the opposite extreme and look in the bottom right here where we're up to 100% impervious surfaces, complete build out system. Look at the changes to the water cycle there. Instead of being 40% evaporation, there's 30% evaporation. Instead of there being only 10% runoff, there's 55% runoff. And that's because we're not allowing the water to infiltrate back in the ground. It's got to go somewhere. So instead of 50% of the water infiltrating in a natural ground cover, only 15 or 1.5 goes into infiltration when you have higher amounts of impervious surfaces, or the highest amount, 100%. So you can see there's these shifts in the amount of water and where it's going. So if you have all this excess runoff, you'll get situations like what I showed you before when looking at the storm Ida that came through last September, that you're going to get more flooding, you're going to have more problems because the impervious surfaces build up a lot of the materials on it in terms of like sand and salt and any sort of landscaping materials of herbicides, et cetera, fertilizers that are applied to it, that'll just get all picked up and washed downstream to local waterways. And so one of the things that we strive to do at Jersey Friendly Yards is to prevent that from happening. And one of the ways you can do that is by being able to, use water wisely. And so the next question is, this is all the kind of the doom and gloom portion about what's going on, but what can you do about all this? And especially what can you do about all this in terms of the amount of water that you're using and how can you save water and what are some of the steps you can take to reduce your water footprint, et cetera. A lot of what I'm going to talk about tonight isn't necessarily specific to a practice that directly involves water. And the first one I'm going to talk about is using native plants. But they do have an impact on the water use that you'll have at home. So I will go through kind of the benefits of, to water by doing these different practices. But you'll also notice that a lot of the practices I'm going to talk about are themselves other steps in the Jersey Friendly Yards program. So you can reduce your water use by maintaining healthy soils, which is step 2. So if you do these steps in order, you will have kind of like this cumulative impact on your yard and on the use of not just, increasing native plants, not using as much fertilizers or pesticides, not using as much water, but also maintaining healthy soils and reusing and reducing some of the materials that you have in your landscape, et cetera. So I just want you guys to be aware that all the steps, even though we're talking about them discreetly, they do kind of play off of each other. So keep that in mind when I start going into a little bit of detail about this. So what are some of the things that you can do about all this? What are some things related to water that you can do? And the first big thing you can do is use native plants. And we're talking about plants that are indigenous to a given area. Basically, the timeline that a lot of people use is those types of plants that were on the continent before European settlement. So whatever was growing here before people from Europe settled the United States. or the North American continent. So we look at that kind of demarcation, before 1600, before 1650, et cetera. What was growing here naturally? Those are what we're kind of thinking of as native plants. The native plants, because they've been growing here naturally, and you can find them naturally here, they are adapted to local conditions. They're adapted to that rainfall amount I mentioned before, that 42 to 45 inches per year. They're adapted to how cold it gets at night or when our freezing starts to happen, or their hardiness, how well they can handle a change in temperature, especially going down to an extreme temperature down low and freezing up. And they're also adapted to local soil types. So soil types can change in a matter of feet. So plants are adapted to those. So one of the things you can do is use native plants. And just as a little fun fact, I read somewhere that you can actually save about 55 gallons of water per square foot of your yard if you replace turf grass with native plants. Once again, you can save 55 gallons of water per square foot. So think of like a tile that's, put on a bathroom floor, put in a kitchen floor, per square foot by replacing the turf grass with native plants. That's a huge savings. And 55 gallons is about the size of what you would think of as a barrel or a drum, etc. Okay, so I just wanted to kind of reinforce when I'm talking about the hardiness. Here's a hardiness map from USDA, US Department of Agriculture, that shows the hardiness zones for New Jersey. We're in 6A, 6B, 7A, and 7B. And you can see at the bottom right here, they show you the different temperature extremes that it basically gets down to in terms of freezing and whether or not plants can grow in there. So sometimes you'll find a plant, you'll look it up and it'll say it grows best in zone 6A. Well, that's the dark green areas kind of in the Sussex and Warren County, a little bit near that Hackettstown that's up on the map shown. So in the northeastern part of the state, northwestern part of the state, excuse me. But then if you look at the southeastern part, like in Toms River or Ocean County, we're looking more towards 7A. So those plants are adapted to it being slightly warmer because they're a little bit further south. So their freezing temperature is a little bit higher than, say, the ones that you find up in Sussex and Warren County. So this is what the hardiness zone is that we're talking about. It's like how tolerant is the plant of the coldest temperatures and that freezing that's happening. So one of the big questions that people are probably asking, well, how do I figure out what native plants are out there and what can I use in my yard? And Jersey Friendly Yards has a great resource. It's got a whole ton of resources, but fantastic resource in terms of its plant database. So if you go to jerseyyards.org, remember the double Y, jerseyyards.org, go to the plant database and native New Jersey plants, and then you can type in the database looking for a specific plant, or you can check off all the different features of your yard in terms of soil type, in terms of shade and sunlight, in terms of moisture content, in terms of if you know pH, whether you want something that's native, you can pick bloom color, you can pick deer resistance, you can pick whether or not you're in the coastal plain, which is sandier soils. It will give you a list of native plants that you can plant within that. So Jersey Friendly Yards is a fantastic resource. So props to Karen, Bargain Bay Partnership, and Becky at Ocean County Soil Conservation District for putting this together and basically making a very user-friendly way to pick out the plants that you need for your particular yard and your particular needs. There is a short video tutorial on the website to kind of guide you through the process of going through the database and figuring out the different pieces of your yard that you need to kind of get the information on. You don't need a complete picture of your yard, but at least an idea of what's happening in your landscape in terms of the amount of sunlight, moisture content, what you think your soil is it sandy, is it silty, that kind of stuff. So if you have that information, you can really help pick out native plants. One of the other key things is there's also a list of nurseries by county that you sell native plants, so you can use that to help find local places that you can purchase native plants from. And I know we're in the process of updating that list, so be on the lookout for that. So you can go ahead and use native plants. So that's step one. Second, I think I mentioned before, is you can actually harvest rainwater. So if you have a rain barrel or some other cistern device to capture water, you can actually use that water on your plants in your landscape and actually prevent it from becoming runoff and before it gets into the stream, into the storm sewer, excuse me. So you can actually attach a rain barrel to your downspout, collect the water from your gutter, from your roof, disconnect that water before it gets into the storm sewer system, capture the 55 gallons in your rain barrel, collect from the spigot or put in a pump it out, and use it on your plants. Okay. So one of the things that's really beneficial about rain barrels is that over the course of the growing season, basically from April through October, if you utilize the water from your rain barrel regularly, you can save about 1,400 gallons during that time period. And remember, I said before that on average, we use about 70 gallons per day. That's outside of the growing season. We use about 155. But just think that's anywhere from like 10 to 20 days of water that you've saved just by using one 55-gallon rain barrel over the course of it. So you can have a huge impact by just having one rain barrel and saving up anywhere from 10 to 20 days worth of water by using your rain barrel and using it properly. But not just rain barrels, there's other ways you can go ahead and kind of quote unquote harvest rainwater. On the bottom left here is the publication that we came out with, which teaches you how to build a rain barrel from a plastic trash can. So it doesn't have to be a fancy rain barrel that you purchase from a big box store. You can actually do it yourself. So we do have some fact sheets on DIY systems like this plastic trash can. But you can also just take your downspouts and divert them off of those impervious surfaces into pervious surfaces like your lawn or in landscape areas. So you can see in the upper left here, they've extended the downspout past all the hard materials and into their yard so that they can water their yard just by having the rainfall go from the roof, downspout, gutter, downspout, and then into their yard directly. I also like to mention for people, if you're not a homeowner and you're in an apartment or you're in, a rental unit, you can also use the harvested rainwater for your plants that are in pots as well. So don't just think this is for people who own yards and watering their lawns and watering the landscape plants. If you have plants that are in pots on decks or inside, you can collect a little bit of rainwater and do your part and use those in those pots as well. But then you can also do something like on the bottom right here, which is basically a rainwater planter. So the downspouts go into this planter, the plants are in there, there's an overfill. So if it gets too full, it kind of goes out into a pervious area, but it basically fills up this kind of box with the water. The plants love it. There's enough soil to absorb a lot of the water. And then they don't have to keep watering it. They just let the rainfall naturally happen for naturally water those plants as well. So there are different ways you can harvest rainwater that don't include just having a rain barrel. But one of the things I can't stress enough is there are lots of do's and don'ts, but the biggest don'ts when you're harvesting rainwater is to not use the rain barrel water or the rainwater that you harvest for cooking or drinking. I will repeat that again. Do not use rain barrel water for cooking or drinking. Do not use rain barrel water for cooking or drinking. This is really for your plants as well. Outside, this is not for you. And also, don't collect rainwater if you have used any sort of moss killer or any sort of herbicide on your roof. So if you have a roof that's very shady, it gets very wet and moss grows on it, and you put an herbicide on it, a moss or algae killer on it, that will actually affect your plants as that water will, as that herbicide will get collected in the rainwater, go in your rain barrel and just stay there. And it's just primed for you to put on your plants and can actually harm the plants that you want to actually protect. So if you've used some sort of moss killer or algae killer on your roof, do not collect the rainwater from that part of your roof. And don't use that water for your landscape plants because you'll just do more harm than good with that. So the two steps we've taken so far is you can use native plants. That'll save you some water. You can also harvest rainwater. The other thing that you can do is basically just follow some smart watering practices. And the basic thing to keep in mind is that landscape plants do not need that much water on a weekly basis. They only need, in general, about 1 to 1.5 inches of water per week, and that includes rainfall. So if it rains, 1 inch one day, you're good for a week. So you don't have to worry about it. So you want to make sure that you're only staying within this 1 inch to 1.5 inches per week. Remember to include rainfall in that. If it tends to be drier out, you can use your irrigation system, you can use your watering system to do that. But basically just keep in mind that you only need about 1 inch to 1.5 inches per week. for your most landscaping plants. Obviously, it's going to depend on whether you use an inch or an inch and a half, depending on your soil type, the types of plants you have, etc. Native plants are great because they'll actually be on the lower end of this, so you'll be using less water, so you'll be more on the inch side per week, especially at the beginning when you first plant them. But over time, they'll get adapted to local conditions and will require even less water over time. Remember that the best time to water during the day is early morning, so between 4 and 8 a.m. This is the coolest part of the day. You won't lose a lot of water to evaporation. And you also want to avoid days where it's really windy. And you want to avoid the middle of the day because obviously that's the hottest part of the day and you can evaporate a lot of the water and you're basically just watering the atmosphere at that point and not watering your plants. The one thing you want to keep in mind is that if you have an irrigation system, or even if you're just hooking up a hose to a faucet, make sure that all that's working properly, there aren't any leaks, etc. And if you have a irrigation system, make sure that the sprayers aren't pointed at pavement. You can see from this photo on the right, this is the thought I had going through my head, which is no matter how much you water a sidewalk, it will not grow. So you want to make sure that the water that you are utilizing is going in the right direction, going to the right plants, and it's not being wasted by going on to a hard surface like this sidewalk here or other cemented area. You don't want it hitting the side of your house, for example. You don't want it hitting a fence. You want it hitting the plants so the water gets to the plants and it gets to them properly. And the reason why you want to kind of keep your watering practices smart and actually, not overwater plants is because, as I mentioned before, with the nutrients like the nitrogen and phosphorus, too much of something, even if it's good for you, can be bad. So here we just have some examples of some of the things that can happen if you have too much or too little water and how that can affect your plants. If you have too much water, it can actually increase the chances of your plants getting a disease, especially like a fungus or a mold, because they like moist, cool conditions, so that'll grow on a plant. One of the things that we deal with in cooperative extension is if you have a home garden and you grow basil, it's called basil downy mildew, and that's due to it being too moist, too wet, too much watering. That can grow and really cause a problem and kind of wipe out your whole basil crop or what you're trying to grow. So you really want to make sure that when you're watering that you're not doing too much and you're not doing too little, because too much can cause a problem and too little obviously is basically kind of, a little kind of starving your plant. So these are just some of the things to look at your landscape. If you're overwatering, your leaves will look yellow and wilted, which when I was younger and before I got in the know, I always thought that meant that it didn't have enough water. So you would add more water, and then obviously you get into this cycle of you're just adding more water and adding more water, etc. So you want to look for leaves that are wilted and yellow. That's a sign of overwatering. You want to cut back on the watering, see what that does with the plant, see if that causes it to perk back up and become green and bright and vibrant in the color it's supposed to be. If there's not enough water, if you have dehydration, the leaves will start to look dry and they'll start to feel crunchy and they might even start to turn brown. So that's what you want to look for if you're not watering enough. So to kind of keep that idea in your head, that 1 to 1.5 inches, look at your plants and see what they're telling you. All cooperative extension offices have the ability to kind of like look at plants. Like if you bring them a plant, they can kind of tell you, hey, this might be wrong with it. This is something you want to think about. So if you see some problems with your plants, contact your local county cooperative extension office, and they should be able to help walk you through it, especially our Master Gardener programs and answering your questions related to the plant health, etc. So these are just some general things in terms of water to keep in mind. So how do you make sure that you're giving your plants enough water? One of the best ways to do that is to actually use a rain gauge. So a way to measure the amount of rainfall that you have in your yard in a different area. And you can do it, you can have one rain gauge in one yard, or you can have a couple of them in different spots if you have different landscape areas, your turf areas versus, your shrub areas, your flower beds, etc. So the way you kind of do this is you get a rain gauge, which is the blue device in the photo on the right, which measures the inches of water as it goes through. You want to run your sprinkler or your irrigation system, or you want to water your area for about 30 minutes, and you want to see what the depth is in the rain gauge, and then multiply that by 2, and that'll tell you how much water you're putting out per hour. So if you water it and you get like 1/2 inch in an hour and in 30 minutes, that means you have 1 inch in 1 hour. that means that you can run your sprinkler system 1 hour a week, without rainfall, and then you've met that 1 inch per week criteria I mentioned before. So it's a great way to kind of keep track of how much water you're putting out there. You also want to keep track of local rainfall and add that to any sort of irrigation that you do as well through the rain gauge. So the rain gauge will tell you the irrigation will also take in rainfall if you have it in an open enough area that it will collect rainfall and give you the total amount. But bear in mind that, you might need to kind of like stay on top of what's happening in the weather. And if you're a good gardener and you're taking care of your landscape properly, you kind of keep your eye on the weather, hopefully, so you're not overwatering or underwatering your plants. But you want to make sure that you keep an eye on the weather and add that rainfall amount to the amount that you're irrigating your yard. And since it's 2022, it's the 21st century, there's an app for this too. So this is an app that I actually have on my phone. It's called the Pocket Rain Gauge. If you just Google Pocket Rain Gauge app, this is what will come up. And basically what it does is it uses a GPS location to find out where you're standing. You click on the app, you click on your location, it will tell you where you're standing, and it will give you the rainfall in the past 24 hours. So you kind of have to watch it, basically at the same time every day to kind of get a total amount of rainfall for the week. So you can see in this example here, from when I did it at our office in Whitesville Road, there was no rain in the previous 24 hours. So that means, okay, no rain today. Will there be rain in the forecast, etc.? It doesn't include forecasting options. It just tells you what's happened in the past 24 hours. So if you're curious as to a rainstorm coming through, you can get this app, click on your location, and it'll tell you how much rain came through the storm system that kind of blew through overnight, etc. It's a good way to just kind of have it on you all the time to figure out how much rain has fallen and whether or not you need to do some heavy watering, etc. So that's a good smart practice to follow. One of the other things that's a good watering practice is to use drip irrigation. And drip irrigation is basically the use of tubing that has holes in it that you pump water through so it delivers water directly to the plant. So you basically run this tubing along your plants or through your landscaping, and it will deliver the water through the plant. So rather than spraying it in the air and then losing some of that water to evaporation, it'll directly apply the water to the plant and to the soil. It allows the water to seep slowly into the soil, like a few drops at a time, one to a few drops at a time. And what this does is this increases the efficiency of your watering, and it's 90 to 95% efficient, as opposed to being much lower to a spray irrigation as you lose it to the side of your house, the fence, the sidewalk, but also to the atmosphere as it evaporates, etc. So it's a lot less efficient to do the spray irrigation than to do the drip irrigation. So you have less water that's lost to that evaporation, the wind, etc. You also have a lower chance of getting plant disease because you won't be overwatering the plants and kind of spraying the water everywhere. So it's a great system if you're able to do it to increase efficiently use water and use less water in your landscape. And there's a couple ways you can do it. On the upper left, this is a soaker hose, so it's got little tiny holes in the hole in the fabric that makes up the hose. The water kind of seeps out in drips, as you can see collecting here on the outside of it. Or you've got an old hose and you want to recycle some of that material, which is another step in the Jersey Friendly Yards, is recycling and reducing some of the materials that you have. You can actually drill holes in an old hose that you have, and then just hook it up to a water source. An example at the bottom here, they've got a garden where they've hooked up some of the hoses that have holes in it to a rain barrel. So you can combine your efforts, like doing rainwater harvesting and drip irrigation, all in one to reduce your water footprint and use less water and water wisely. The next thing that you can do that's a good watering practice is to mulch. Using mulch will help retain soil moisture. It's going to reduce evaporation. It reduces the exposure to the wind, which can also increase evaporation and loss of water from the soil. It will help maintain soil moisture so you don't have to keep watering and adding excess amounts of water to that soil. It will also act as a way to insulate the top layer of soil and keep it kind of cooler so there's less evaporation of that top layer of soil, so you retain the soil moisture that way down as well. It will help to keep weeds under control. And one of the things is if there are weeds that do pop up, they are much easier to remove because they don't have that strong of a footing because there's only a couple of them that you can pull out. So hand pulling your weeds with mulch is a great way to reduce your herbicide use, but it's also a great way to help maintain some water. Over the long term, especially if you're using some sort of organic material or a bark that doesn't have a lot of dyes in it, etc., it can improve soil texture over time as that mulch breaks down. So if you use like a leaf mulch, a grass mulch, or a tree bark mulch, that stuff can break down over time and can improve the soil texture and quality by adding nutrients slowly over time and actually building up the top layers of soils, etc. And one of the things that mulch really does too is when we do have precipitation, it helps to prevent a lot of erosion and loss of topsoil by reducing the rain splash and preventing some of that runoff from happening that I mentioned before. So if you have a steep yard, mulch is great because it will help slow down that runoff. It'll help to reduce the rain splash so you won't lose your soil to erosion. You won't lose that soil as it gets washed away through runoff, etc. So if you're going to mulch, the recommendations are, in general, the depth of mulch you put out there should be no more than 3 inches. And this should include any mulch that's remaining from any previous applications that you've done from previous years or previous seasons. So you want a total depth of no more than 3 inches. You don't want those mulch volcanoes being mounded up to the side of a tree trunk or a shrub trunk, etc. You want to make sure that it's pretty flat over an area, but you don't want to do it more than 3 inches. Except if you have soils that you know are compacted, or they don't drain so well, they might have a high clay content within it, you shouldn't exceed 2 inches because the water doesn't really have that great of a place to go because of the compacted or poorly drained soil. So you want to actually keep less mulch up there because you don't want to retain that water in the long term because then you'll increase flooding, etc. And that'll really affect your yard, especially if you have shallow rooted plants. So in general, no more than 3 inches of mulch, unless your soils are compacted or poorly drained, then you want no more than 2 inches. So you want to put less than that. And obviously it's going to depend on the type of mulch you use, etc. So just kind of keep that in mind in terms of general guidelines for using mulch. So I did mention some compacted soils. One of the things you can do to help not use so much water is to maintain healthy soil. And compacted soils are those soils that act like an impervious surface. So they're really kind of packed together tightly and water can't infiltrate through it. So the top part of this graphic shows you that water's trying to infiltrate into the soil. It can get through the non-compacted soil, but it can't make its way through the compacted soil. So it's just going to run off the top. And as it goes left and right with those arrows, it will actually wash away and erode some of that non-compacted soil. So you'll lose some topsoil there. So the photos at the bottom are from Georgian Court University in Lakewood in Ocean County, New Jersey. You can see there's some water ponding on the surface because of some of the compacted soils they have. So you have these areas where you have water ponding. Too much water can, affect trees that can't handle that much water. Obviously, you can increase breeding habitat for mosquitoes, etc. But by maintaining healthy soil, you'll be able to use less water because the water will have a place to go if it goes down. So you're using less water by having healthier soils because it will eventually get to the plant roots that you're trying to go. If you have compacted soils, the water's not going anywhere. You're just wasting water. It's sitting on the water surface like in these photos here, and it's not getting to the plants that are going to need it. So it doesn't count towards that 1 to 1.5 inches I mentioned before. And one of the best things you can do is if you do have an unhealthy soil or a heavily compacted soil is to aerate your soil. This will improve the infiltration of the soils, allows that soil to absorb that water as it comes in, actually brings more oxygen to the soil as well and to the plant roots, which will help them thrive. So you'll get better root systems, healthier plants in the long run, etc. It will also make nutrients more available to plants, especially in the root system as the nutrients get further down into the holes that you create from aerating, etc. So it's really great way to help improve soil health, but also improve plant health and save you water because you have healthier plants with deeper root systems that'll be able to handle less water being added through irrigation, etc. So the things you want to keep in mind when you're aerating soil, core aeration is probably the best way to do it, and basically pulling out a core of soil. So think of like a wine cork shaped piece of soil, plug of soil that gets pulled out. typically 1/2 to 3/4 of an inch in diameter and about 3 or 4 inches long. It pulls that out from the ground. The best time to do it is either in September or in early spring, which is basically now, being, mid-April at this point. So if you want to do core aeration, this is one of the best times to do it. If you have compaction, bear in mind that core aeration will just handle shallow compaction. It won't get too far down because you are only taking 3 or 4 inches of that soil out. But it can have a very quick and significant improvement in the condition of your topsoil by allowing the air and oxygen to make its way to the roots of the plants, allowing more water to get in, etc. You can leave the cores on the soil, on the turf, if you're doing a lawn area like in the photo here. You can rake them into the lawn, but you want to make sure that you do not fill the holes back up, because the point of the aeration is to ensure that those holes are there, allowing oxygen, allowing water to get back into the soil and to the plant roots that are there. So if you want more information on dealing with soil compaction, this is a fact sheet that we came out with about 2 years ago, working on assessing and addressing soil compaction in your yard. And once again, I will make these slides available to people who participated on today's webinar so that you guys can have the links for getting these fact sheets and the other things I mentioned before. So I said at the beginning, why should we conserve water and why should we water wisely? Well, here's kind of the takeaways. Saving water will save drinking water from being used from a non-drinking purpose, i.e. irrigation. So all of our water treatment facilities are out there treating water and cleaning it up so that we can drink it and it's safe for us to drink. And over half of it during the growing season from April through October gets just sprayed on our yard. So collecting things in rain barrels and other cisterns helps to save that kind of water that's meant for drinking purposes and cooking purposes and eating purposes from not being used for different purposes, for watering your landscape, etc. So make sure that you keep those two separate. Obviously, I mentioned before, rain barrels do not cook and drink that. But it saves the water that's coming into your house that's meant for drinking purposes from being utilized in irrigation. So if you have a rain barrel system or a cistern system, you can actually save drinking water in that way. It will save money on utility bills if you are collecting rainwater, if you are using less water through irrigation and knowing how much rainfall has happened and how much you're irrigating each week. I'm not saying you'll retire tomorrow, but over the long term, you will be able to save some money on your utility bills by not having that output of water be more significant than what it was, before you started doing some of these practices to conserve water. It does help prevent water pollution. So by installing things like native plants, you're using less water. You're also using less herbicides, less fertilizer. So those things won't build up on a yard and during a rainstorm get washed off and be part of that alphabet soup of pollution I mentioned before. So it does help prevent water pollution by saving water. It does protect your valuable landscape plants, especially during times of drought, because if you have a system like a rain barrel or a cistern system that collects water, you've put a lot of time, money, and dollars into your landscaping plants. You want to protect those, especially when there's not that much water happening naturally through rainfall. So during a drought time, you can actually have a collection system that will help to feed your plants rather than utilizing that potable water I mentioned before. And one of the other things that saving water does and helping prevent a lot of this runoff is it helps to extend the life of septic systems and our stormwater infrastructure. So by holding some of the water in your yard, by using less of it, creating less runoff, you're actually extending the life of the storm drains, the sewer pipes, all those things that basically do have an expiration date. They do last for maybe 30 or 40 years. You're extending that lifespan by preventing less water from going through them. It's a little bit, but if everybody does their part and it gets added up cumulatively, it can have a larger impact in the long run. And especially if you are working towards being Jersey-friendly yards, you'll have these impacts and so many more. So hopefully you've learned a couple of things tonight. You've gotten a couple of tips on how to conserve water and what are some of the things you can do. So what are you going to do to save water is kind of my question for everybody here. What are you going to try and do at home to save water? Could be something that you want to do indoors, but obviously I've been talking about doing stuff outside. But what are you going to do to help save water? Because it's really a valuable resource that we really need to help protect and help to conserve. So that's my time. I'm here for any questions if people want to ask any questions, but thank you all very much for your time and attention. And I hope you at least learned one tip for tonight that you might want to give a try to help make your yard a little bit more Jersey friendly. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Steve. That was excellent. We do have a few questions. I'll relay the ones in the chat, and I know Becky has some that came in the Q&A as well.
So I'll just leave my contact information up in case people want to, write it down. But I'll make sure to get the slides to you, Karen, so we can get those out to everybody who
That's
participated
great.
tonight. So
Yeah, so we are recording this,
oh, great.
and we'll put that link on the website, but I'll also put a link to the PDF of the slides
Okay,
in the same place. It'll be on the 2022 events Jersey Friendly Arts webinar page.
fantastic.
Okay, so actually one question, Becky relayed this, but I'll go ahead and ask. Someone did ask, can you use your rain barrel water on your edibles, your vegetable garden or your fruit plants?
Okay. So this is usually one of the first questions we get after we tell people they can't use it to cook or eat with. If you want to use rainwater that you've harvested on a vegetable garden or a fruit garden, etc., what we recommend is that you follow kind of the drip irrigation principle, and that you apply the water to the soil and not to the plant itself. And you try your best to avoid any of the parts of the plant that you would actually ingest. So if you have a tomato plant, you obviously want to prevent the water from hitting the flowers or the fruits as they come up. So you want to make sure that the water gets into the soil as opposed to onto the plant itself. You can go to a place to get your water tested. That's slightly expensive though, so if people want to avoid that. But one of the things you want to do when you have a rain barrel, one of the best things you can do is actually actively use your water by constantly having that water kind of move through your rain barrel, not just sitting there stagnant. That helps to kind of keep it from, for lack of a better word, going bad. So if you're able to use the water on like landscaping plants that you're not going to eat, use it then. But if you do want to use it on vegetable gardens or any sort of fruit garden that you have, or any other crops that you're planning on eating, your best option is to actually put it on the soil and not on the plants itself. Is the safest thing you can do. So once again, I'll advocate for drip irrigation. It's probably the easiest thing to do, even if it's just an old hose that you've drilled some holes in that can slowly trickle the water out. Do that as well. But do your best not to get the water onto the plants itself if you're using water from a rain barrel.
Excellent. I just learned something too. Um, we had a few questions about the mulch. So one person asked, is it better to use leaf mulch or compost rather than the wood mulch? And then there was a part two to that. The same person also asked if you could mention the use of ground covers as mulch, like a green mulch.
Okay. So the first part of the question is which mulch is better? Um, I'm gonna give you the answer you probably didn't want to hear, which is it depends. It depends on what your needs are, how big of an area you're trying to mulch, etc. But remember that those different mulches that are mentioned between compost and leaf mulch and bark mulch, they break down at different rates, and they'll basically be different sizes. So if you're dealing with something like a leaf mulch versus a bark mulch, you're actually going to use less leaf mulch because it's smaller and it will actually break down quicker. So if you're going to do a leaf mulch and put that down in your yard, you're going to go on the lower end of that recommended 3 inches I mentioned before. You might want to just put about an inch down because it will break down quickly, and obviously get back into the soil that much more quickly. But also that means you're going to have to replace it more often. So you have to make sure that you stay on top of it and you know how much is going to be there. So you want to put less of it in there because it's going to break down quickly over time. Whereas the bark mulch, you can put a little bit more in there because, you'll put in, let's say, like 2 inches of it. The bottom inch of that's in contact with the soil will start to break down a little bit more quickly, and the top inch might get washed around a little bit or moved around during a rainstorm, etc. So it might not break down as quickly, but it's just physically bigger pieces of material. So that's why it's going to take longer. So it's all going to depend on what your needs are. what you think you're going to do in the long term for those areas, especially with compost, because that's not just mulch, that's also nutrients that are starting to break down a little bit more quickly than even the leaf mulch. So you're going to add nutrients. So my recommendation would be, as a good extension agent, is to get a soil test so that you know what you need to put down, whether or not your soil is going to be, moist enough, and have enough water within it, whether or not you need to add any nutrients. And then you can decide from there, oh, I need to put nutrients down. Maybe I'll think about putting a compost mulch or a leaf mulch because I know that will add nutrients in the long term and help maintain soil health. So I would say first do a soil test so you know what's going on with your soil before you start putting down mulches, etc., and seeing what type you need.
Thanks. And then she was asking,
Oh,
wouldn't the green mulch or the ground cover be really the best of all? That's was her question.
yeah, sorry, I forgot about the second part of
It's
the question.
okay.
The second part being ground covers. I personally am all for ground covers, because you're putting down basically a living carpet of material down. Obviously, I'm going to recommend a native ground cover. Please don't ask me which one at this point. I can't think off the top of my head, but the Jersey Friendly Yard database is a great source to go to utilize for finding out ground covers. I personally would say try to pack in as many plants as you can in an area. Make it look more like a natural meadow than a manicured landscape. So that's me taking off my extension hat and putting on my own personal hat. That the more plants you have out there, the less mulch you'll need to put down. Um, the less topsoil you'll lose because the roots will hold the soil in place. So I would try and pack in as many things as you can, especially if you have a taller or larger plant form like a tree or a shrub. If you're able to get something that can grow in the shade, and look at the different levels of your yard, in terms of thinking about, well, what's our canopy and what's the trees that are up there? What can we put on the ground below? What can grow in the shade? Can we put ferns down there? Can we get something else that can grow in there? So I would just think about it on the different levels. And my recommendation would be if you're able to get a ground cover in, I think that's fantastic. If you're also able to put in, as opposed to planting a whole bunch of native plants, maybe get a native seed mix for like pollinators and put that out in the area and just let everything grow up that needs to grow up for local insects to utilize. So that would be my recommendation. Going with a ground cover I would say, is a thumbs up for me, two thumbs up from me. But I would say go with something native and try to get a larger bang for your buck out of it by having it be like a pollinator habitat so you can get some of the local insect populations going, etc. That's something you can do. I think it's a great idea if you're able to do it. But if you want to avoid mulches, just try and pack as many of the plants in as you can within reason. Bear in mind that the plants are going to need some room to kind of grow and breathe themselves. So make sure that you're spacing them out properly. But if you're able to pack in a whole bunch of smaller plants and ground covers, I think that's a great idea.
Okay, Becky, I'm going to pass the relay questions over to you now.
Great. So a couple questions, Steve. This first one is from Penny, and Penny says, very informative. Thank you. Are there any state county extension programs for building a rain barrel?
For building a rain barrel. I don't know if there are any extension specific ones. I can tell you that for parts of Atlantic County, we are in the process of working with some of the local municipal green teams, that an organization like Save Barnegat Bay, which is different than Barnegat Bay Partnership. Save Barnegat Bay is working with some towns in the Mullica River watershed to do rain barrel workshops there. I would say the best place to look for is through the State Department of Environmental Protection, the DEP's Watershed Ambassador Program. I know somebody is housed at Barnegat Bay Partnership, so I see Karen shaking her head as soon as I say Watershed Ambassador. Their Watershed Ambassador Program, these are students or recent college graduates who are working on education outreach programs on watershed health, rain barrel workshops, rain gardens, etc. So that might be a great resource. But you can always contact your local extension office. And if we don't know the answer, we'll find out the answer for you and get it to you. So that's the best we could do for that. But I know Save Barnegat Bay and the Barnegat Bay watershed is doing some rain barrel workshops. I know that the watershed ambassadors that are working like with Barnegat Bay Partnership do that as well. We ourselves do not have any plans for them, but we do have the materials online through our fact sheets for how to build one yourself and get all the materials, et cetera, from a plastic garbage can or from a recycled 55-gallon drum as well. So there's lots of resources out there for rain barrels. Or just email me. My email's still up on the screen, so email me and I'll see what I can do.
And Penny thanks you. Okay,
welcome,
next
Penny.
question. I'm going to go back to the mulch. This one's from Barb, and Barb writes, what is your opinion of using sweet peat as a mulch if you can get it?
I'm going to be honest, I have no opinion on it. So I'm assuming you're talking about putting down some sort of peat moss as a mulch to help with water retention. I'm going to assume, hopefully you're putting in the chat, yes, that's what I meant. I would say that that's a good kind of dual purpose, because you'll actually have much more water retention because peat moss holds onto a lot more water. But you got to make sure that you have the right kind of yard conditions for that. You don't want to make sure it's in an area where you're not going to dry it out all the time. It will still have a chance to retain some of the moisture and stay cool. So you don't want it in a hugely sunny area. I said I didn't have an opinion, but obviously I have an opinion on it. But I think it's a good idea to do that in conjunction with other types of methods of water control or water conservation as well. So I would just be careful with doing it and making sure that you have the right yard conditions for it. And obviously you don't want to like put the peat out, water it, have it get waterlogged and get like washed down like a slope. If you have a steep slope yard, you want to be careful of your yard conditions. That would be something that I would have to like do a little bit more research on to get an answer for them, but it could be something that we look into in terms of a peat mulch. I know that there are additional resources on the Cooperative Extension website for mulching and composting. So there might be something up there on peat. I haven't seen anything myself, but I could take a look and see if we can find some of that information for you guys.
And then what about pine needle mulch?
Ooh, that's a tough one. Because that can drastically affect the soil conditions. So you want to be careful with putting down pine needle mulch, or just kind of raking up pine, the needles in your yard. You want to be careful with that because it can affect, I believe, the pH of your soil. And you want to be careful because that can affect, what plants you're able to grow in an area. I think one of the things you want to keep in mind is to look at your yard kind of holistically. And not just look at each of these individual steps that we're talking about, even though we are talking about each step individually, but think about your yard as a whole and what kind of landscape you want to have. If you want something that's got a lot of pine, pine and evergreen material within it, vegetation growing in it, that's one of the things you'll have to think of in the long run. Well, what are some of the plants that can grow alongside evergreens or pines so that they will survive if a whole bunch of needles drop and they're on the ground? So kind of think of it as a whole ecology, for lack of a better word, rather than just the individual pieces of it. So make sure that if you want to use pine needle mulch, that you have plants that are going to be able to handle, the soil conditions where that would be able to thrive and actually work for you. Because obviously you don't want to put stuff in the ground or put stuff on your ground that's going to affect what you put in the ground and, waste your time, waste your money. You don't want to harm these resources. You really want to work with them. So I would say think holistically and look at what kind of would be able to grow together. And one of the best ways to do that is, once again, the Jersey Friendly Yards Native Plant Database will give you all the site conditions that are, that you can plug in for your yard, and we'll give you the best plants that will grow in there. And you can just tell me all plants. So if you're looking for a tree, you can go through the trees and see what's going to work in your site. If you want just the grasses or flowering plants or shrubs, if you want to look at all those different forms, then you'll get a whole list of those that you can see kind of grow together and will work together. So think of it that kind of like holistic, larger vision rather than just individually. So if you want to use pine needle mulch, make sure that you're going to get plants that grow alongside, pine trees and in more, pinelands-like areas out in the world, so that they will actually thrive. So you're not, inadvertently affecting your plants by putting down this pine needle mulch. So just think of that in a larger picture.
Good answer. I agree 100%, to look at our yards as ecosystems and plant communities.
Yeah.
All right, this next question has a couple parts. So it's from Tom. Tom writes, we may have to redo our driveway in the near future and are also planning to put in a patio. Any suggestions as far as designer materials? I'm assuming permeable surfaces are better for the environment, but not sure what's best. And for further context, we do have a dry well where most of the runoff ends up. So maybe that negates the need for permeable materials. What are your thoughts on that?
I have too many. That's why I can't speak right now. I have too many thoughts. I think first and foremost, if you're going to plan a landscape in terms of like a new driveway or a patio, I would say try to reduce that footprint as much as you can in what will realistically work for you. Obviously, don't put in like, a 4 foot by 4 foot patio if really you want a big deck to actually entertain on and stuff. Just do what's going to realistically work for you. If you're able to incorporate pervious or permeable materials in, say, your driveway with like a permeable asphalt or a permeable pavement, that's fantastic. That's going to be slightly more expensive because there's a little bit more engineering that's involved with that. But if you actually just kind of like make smaller the footprint of that driveway, or you have the driveway actually work its way to, say, a naturalized area where the water can run off into, say, a buffer that you plant alongside your driveway that's got, some flowering material or some shrubs in it, and it holds on to it in a little bit more of a rain garden kind of way, might be a way to hold on to that water a little bit. Or to try and incorporate even just potted native plants. You can just use potted native plants on your patio as a means to help, take in some of the water as well. And obviously native plants will help, even if they're potted, will help with local wildlife if they're those type of plants that are flowering or have berries that they can utilize. I would say that the first thing to think about is just try and reducing the footprint as much as feasible and what will work for you in doing the design or redoing the driveway or redoing the patio. If you have a patio that, is like decking, so that it does have the slats so that the water can kind of go through, to a surface underneath it, that's fine. Obviously, they're going to have to compact the soil underneath the deck to ensure that the deck stays stays as a structure. So you want to make sure that the safety is there first. But if there's a way to kind of like, if you have a deck, to slightly pitch it a little bit so it goes to like a lawn area or a garden area or a landscape area to collect some of the water without obviously making it a tripping hazard or a falling hazard for people. But doing those kind of things to make sure that any sort of water that comes off of those areas goes to a place that's a little bit more naturalized is probably your best bet in the long run if you're not able to close shorten or lessen the footprint to it. So try to get the water to kind of flow to an area that's a little bit more natural, that has plants in it, that has good healthy soils within it, so that it can actually get utilized and back into the ground is probably your best bet.
I agree with Tom. Great suggestions. Makes a lot of sense. So he thanks you for that response. And that's all the questions I have for you.
Oh,
thank you, Steve.
Oh, that was easier than I thought it was going to be. But thank you everybody for being here tonight. There were some great questions. I hope you at least learned one or two things from this evening. I know Becky and Karen are both thrilled to have you guys here tonight with us. But thank you guys so much for joining us. Really appreciate it. And you know, the contact information is on the screen if you want to get in touch with myself or with any other questions that you might have. But thank you so much, and help conserve some water.
Thank you, Steve. A wonderful webinar. Thank you very much. And just to remind everyone, go to our website, 2022 webinar page to get information about the upcoming webinars as we continue to go through the 8 steps.